Harlem didn't erupt. There were no gunshots, no public confrontations, no dramatic announcements. What happened was quieter and far more revealing. In less than a week, the balance of power shifted. Not slowly, not through violence, through behavior. When Bumpy Johnson returned, the streets didn't need instructions. They didn't need confirmation. They adjusted on their own. Conversations changed tone. Meetings were postponed. Decisions that had seemed urgent days earlier were suddenly delayed. People who had been confident stopped acting like it. Nothing was declared publicly, but everyone understood what was happening. The news in 1963 didn't focus on raids or arrests. It focused on speed. How influence consolidated almost immediately. How disputes vanished without mediation. How figures who had spent months asserting control quietly stepped back, not because they were threatened, but because they recognized something familiar reclaiming its place. This wasn't a takeover announced with force. It was a return accepted without resistance. In most power struggles, control changes hands through confrontation. This one didn't. Harlem didn't need to be convinced. It needed to be reminded. And that reminder traveled faster than any order ever could. Within days, it was clear that the city wasn't operating under the same assumptions it had before. Deals stalled, routes stabilized. Old rules resurfaced as if they had never been suspended. The clock didn't slow down. It reset. 1963 became the year that proved something unsettling. When authority is fully internalized, it doesn't need time to rebuild. It only needs space to reassert itself. And once that space opened, Harlem changed hands, almost instantly. Before 1963, Harlem wasn't under siege. It was unsettled. Power existed, but it was divided. Several figures held influence. None of them held authority. Deals went through, money moved, but every arrangement felt temporary. Control had to be reasserted constantly, and that constant noise was the warning sign. When authority is real, it doesn't need reminders. In the months leading up to the return of Bumpy Johnson, Harlem ran on overlapping claims. Each group enforced its slice aggressively, not out of confidence, but out of fear that hesitation would be read as weakness. Meetings multiplied, messages repeated. Threats were issued more often than they were acted on. That's what fragmented power looks like. Loud, busy, and unstable. Nothing was truly out of control, but nothing felt settled either. Law enforcement noticed the pattern immediately. So did the people living inside it. When power is distributed without a recognized center, everyone starts hedging. No one commits fully. Routes change more often than necessary. Agreements are shorter. Loyalty becomes transactional instead of structural. That environment produces motion, not order. Most importantly, Harlem had lost something subtle but critical, a shared reference point. There was no final arbiter, no standard everyone quietly agreed not to violate. Decisions were made based on opportunity, not consequence. And while that can work briefly, it creates friction over time. Friction invites mistakes. By early 1963, the neighborhood was primed for change. Not because it wanted domination, but because it wanted clarity. People weren't asking who would take over. They were asking when the uncertainty would end. This is what makes the events that followed so important. The return didn't disrupt a stable order. It entered a space already searching for alignment. Harlem wasn't resisting control. It was waiting for it. That's why what happened next unfolded so fast. When a system is fragmented, it doesn't need to be conquered. It only needs a center strong enough for everyone else to stop improvising. And when that center reappeared, Harlem didn't have to be persuaded. It already knew how to reorganize itself. The shift didn't announce itself, it registered. Within the first day of Bumpy Johnson returning, Harlem grew quieter. Not empty, just restrained. Phones rang and went unanswered, meetings stayed tentative, messages were passed and then paused, as if everyone was waiting for a confirmation no one wanted to request out loud. That's how authority re-enters a system. Hesitation spreads before direction. No orders came down. No emissaries appeared. But people stopped acting as if speed was protection. In fragmented environments, speed signals confidence. In recentering environments, speed becomes risk. The first instinct wasn't to move, it was to wait. By nightfall, the noise that had defined the previous months had thinned out. Arguments lost urgency. Disputes cooled without mediation. Not because anyone intervened, but because intervention suddenly felt premature. Acting too fast meant being visible. Being visible meant being evaluated. And no one wanted to be evaluated on day one. The most revealing change was psychological. Figures who had been asserting control days earlier stopped making public decisions. They didn't retreat. They recalculated. The question wasn't whether Bumpy would speak. It was whether speaking without alignment would expose you as out of step with what was returning. This is the difference between takeover and restoration. Takeovers demand action. Restoration produces self-correction. By the end of the first 24 hours, Harlem hadn't changed hands yet, but it had changed posture. People weren't looking to gain ground, they were trying not to lose it. That reversal is decisive. Once actors stop advancing and start conserving, authority has already begun to consolidate. Nothing violent occurred, nothing visible needed to. The silence wasn't absence, it was respectful spacing. A collective pause while everyone gauged where the center of gravity was settling. And the speed of that pause told the real story. In less than a day, a fragmented system had instinctively slowed itself down. That's not fear. That's recognition. And recognition, once it spreads, moves faster than any command ever could. By the second day, Harlem wasn't waiting anymore. It was reverting. Routes that had been disputed quietly stabilized. Middlemen stopped negotiating and started confirming. Arguments that would have escalated a week earlier dissolved without anyone stepping in. The most telling sign wasn't who moved, it was who stopped moving. People who had been pushing boundaries suddenly acted as if those boundaries had always been there. No enforcement was visible, no warnings were delivered, yet behavior synchronized. This is what happens when authority returns as memory, not muscle. The rules didn't need to be explained because they weren't new. They had been used before. Everyone knew where they led. And once the environment sensed that those rules were back in effect, improvisation became liability. By day 3, the recalibration was unmistakable. Meetings resumed, but with smaller agendas. Decisions were made faster, but with fewer voices. The tone shifted from competitive to procedural. That's the hallmark of a system that recognizes a center again. Fewer debates, fewer side bets, fewer tests. What's important here is what didn't happen. There was no wave of challenges. No coalition formed to resist the shift. No ambitious figure tried to exploit the moment. That absence wasn't coincidence. It was calculation. Challenging a slow takeover can be organized. Challenging a rapid realignment isolates you immediately, and isolation is fatal in power dynamics. People could feel how quickly consensus was forming. Once that happens, the cost of being wrong rises exponentially. Anyone who pushed back risked being the only one doing so. A position that exposes you not to punishment, but to irrelevance. By midweek, the city wasn't being managed through commands. It was being managed through anticipation. People made decisions based on what they believed the center would approve of, not on what they could get away with. That's the moment authority becomes efficient. Less than 72 hours in, Harlem wasn't negotiating power anymore. It was aligning with it. And alignment doesn't need force. It needs clarity. Once clarity returned, the system did what it had done before. It settled into patterns that minimized risk and maximized predictability. By the end of day 3, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Not because someone had won, but because everyone had stopped pretending the center was missing. By the 4th day, the most striking detail wasn't who had gained ground. It was who chose not to contest it. In most power transitions, resistance appears somewhere. Someone tests the edges. Someone probes for weakness. In Harlem in 1963, that didn't happen. And the reason was simple. The shift was moving too fast to fight without standing alone. Challenging authority requires time. You need allies, coordination, plausible deniability. But when a system realigns almost instantly, the cost of opposition spikes before it can organize. Anyone who pushed back risked being identified immediately, not by force, but by contrast. When everyone else adjusts, the one person who doesn't becomes visible. That visibility is dangerous. People understood that the return of Bumpy Johnson didn't create a vacuum, it removed one. The uncertainty that had allowed smaller players to overextend vanished. What replaced it wasn't fear, but predictability, and predictability favors those who already know the rules. Another factor mattered just as much. Speed compressed choice. There was no drawn-out transition period where alternative centers could form. No window where resistance looked reasonable. By the time anyone could have organized pushback, the environment had already adjusted. Deals were being honored again. Roots had settled. Behavior had normalized. Opposition thrives in ambiguity. This moment erased it. The people who might have challenged the shift understood the math. Even if they succeeded briefly, they would inherit a system that no longer trusted improvisation. They would face isolation, not acclaim. And without broad recognition, power doesn't consolidate. It fractures. So they stood down, not because they were threatened, because resistance no longer offered upside. Harlem chose coordination over competition almost instinctively. That choice wasn't imposed. It was collective self-preservation. Once enough people made it, the rest followed. And when that happens, the idea of challenging authority stops being brave and starts being reckless. By the end of the fourth day, the question had changed. It was no longer, who is in control? It was, why would anyone test it now? And that shift in thinking is what locks a transition in place. Power didn't need to defend itself. It had already become the safest assumption. That's why the takeover faced no resistance. There was nothing left to resist against, only a center everyone recognized and no incentive to pretend otherwise. By the end of the week, nothing needed to be announced. No meeting confirmed it. No message sealed it. The proof was everywhere and nowhere at once, in how decisions flowed, in who waited for whom, in which disputes no longer surfaced at all. Harlem hadn't been conquered. It had settled. That distinction mattered. What returned with Bumpy Johnson wasn't domination. It was resolution. The city didn't feel pressured into compliance. It felt relieved to stop improvising. Routes that had been negotiated daily now ran without discussion. Middlemen stopped testing margins. People acted as if the question of authority had already been answered, because, to them, it had. This is the part outsiders often miss. Power that arrives through force has to keep proving itself. Power that arrives through recognition only has to be acknowledged once. After that, the system does the work on its own. By day 5, Harlem was no longer reacting to a return. It was operating as if the return had always been inevitable. No one celebrated. No one resisted. The absence of both was the signal. Law enforcement noticed it too. Surveillance reports didn't show a spike in activity. They showed a drop in friction, fewer disputes, fewer visible power plays, less noise. That kind of quiet isn't weakness, it's consolidation. It means everyone knows where decisions ultimately resolve, even if that resolution is never spoken aloud. By the 7th day, the timeline closed itself. Whatever ambiguity had existed before was gone. People stopped asking what would happen next because nothing needed to. The city had already reorganized around a center it recognized, trusted, and remembered how to work with. That speed is what made 1963 different from every other chapter. Not years, not months, days. Harlem didn't change hands because someone demanded it. It changed hands because the system preferred certainty to competition, memory to improvisation, and stability to noise. And once those preferences aligned, less than a week was all it took. What happened in 1963 didn't look like a takeover because it wasn't one. It was a reversion. Harlem didn't learn new rules. It remembered old ones. And memory moves faster than force ever can. Bumpy Johnson didn't reclaim control by asserting himself. He reclaimed it by existing in a space that had never fully forgotten him. The system didn't need instruction because it had already been trained. It didn't need threats because it already understood the cost of misalignment. When the center returned, everything else simply stopped pretending it could operate without one. That's why the change happened in days, not months. Authority that has to be rebuilt announces itself. Authority that has been internalized only needs to reappear. And when it does, resistance doesn't organize. It dissolves. Harlem didn't change hands because someone lost. It changed hands because everyone recognized where decisions would now resolve. The speed of that recognition is the real story. It shows how power works when it's embedded deep enough to survive absence. When it returns, it doesn't collide with opposition. It replaces uncertainty. 1963 wasn't about dominance, it was about relief. Relief from fragmentation. Relief from constant negotiation. Relief from pretending there was no center. And once that relief set in, the city did what systems always do when clarity returns. It aligned, it quieted, and it moved forward as if the question had never been open in the first place. That's why Harlem changed hands in less than a week, not because power arrived loudly, but because it never truly left.